Welcome again. I'm trying to return to the basics of Grasshopper for Rhino, but what I'm finding in doing so is that I'm digging deeper and deeper into, if you notice these little control points of what I'm grabbing in this graph. Now you can do that through cross references and trimming here and there, and going high and low on shortest list to longest list. But I think to understand the basics, you actually have to go into this. So what I've done here to try and explain it as a path mapper. That's really what we're looking at as path mapper knows, is I've made a point system. I've constructed a range of points, and all I've done is added 1 to the y and 2 to the z. And the reason I've done that is I don't want to see similar data on the points. So I want the point system to be, as I run it through a path mapper, it's mapping that exactly what it's doing. And if you take a look at what the path mapper does, it's quite extensive to what it talks about it does, and gives you examples of what's going on as you flatten, reverse, remap, and then really get into the fact that you can do, I think, anything with it. So what is it performs lexical operations on data trees. So you've moved beyond objects, you've moved beyond instances, items, you've moved beyond lists, and now you're dealing with lists of lists, and you've got to get a way to grab the geometries off of those. So essentially, that's how complex that's really ending up getting. Now, the Pathmapper writes itself in a very interesting way that as you bring in data that has to come in multiple data and take it to a panel, it will ask you initially when you bring in the Pathmapper. If I bring it in, it will say, okay, what do you want to do with the Pathmapper? You double click on it or right click on it, it'll say create null mapping. It won't allow me to do anything unless there's data running to it. So once you run data to it, this is creating the null mapper. That's all I've done. So maybe I should have said that instead of flatten mapping, we should say create null mapping. So this would be, let me just go in here and just call it null mapping. So once you have data, you can start to create null mapping, and it will give you this kind of frame of writing and I guess scripting in a sense of how this relates to that. It's pretty straightforward. A semicolon B to A semicolon B in curly black brackets. You see the data, and the reason I moved that point and added 1 to the y and z is so you can see that that's 0.1, 1.1, 2.1, and that's a way to understand it. So there's basically your point system of what happens, and there it is. That's what's coming out of the path mapper. At this point is then moved from here over to here in a sense of what I've chosen to do with it because I've done those things to it. Basically, flattening the tree is going to write it and show you how to write that, which is basically take that data, and as you go in, you'll write it all to 0. So it kills it and brings it right down to flattening the tree, all items into one thing, and there it is. All those items are in there, and there's your point system, recorded the same as what was above. No changes. Now, this is where it gets interesting when you get into grafting the map. So when you graph the map and take the points, you'll get everything. And we're going to come back to this, but the system is quite easily read as A, and all of I then goes to ABI, and you put that on everything into that, and you can manipulate this. Now, once you get this much data here, now you're trying to understand, okay, how does the A and the B relate to that I? And we'll come back to that in a minute. The other thing that it gives you when you go into it is you can right-click and you can trim data. And what that does is allow you to take trim data, it sets it up as a method of cutting off the B's, and you're left with just the A's. So in doing so, you can see the data becomes just the stream right up again, similar to the data that was in flatten and similar into the Pathmapper data. Nothing changed, but you're seeing the control of what's happening there. You're visualizing. So throw these points into the center of a sphere or a mesh sphere so you can start to see how you can control geometries by the Pathmapper. This was interesting in the reverse map. It comes up as this one initially, and I think that's kind of nice. I think I've got a line going to it. This is it. It reverses it, puts it in this method. But as I start to do things to the count, like -3 or -6 to that, I end up with this. And you can see this is kind of following the pattern of what happens when I think about, I've trimmed off the edge here, what is happening? Well, these run to 0. So this is not the shortest list or longest list. Something different is happening here as it jumps that way. And we'll go into the other point system as a -8 from it. It's got to read it, and it makes the shortest list of what's out of there. So I'm thinking, what is this? And maybe I don't know the terminology. I don't know all the names. I'm not going through a class. I'm saying, how can I geometrically have control of this in a way that maybe it wasn't intended? There is a point of an artist taking things like oxyacetylene torch, aluminum, plastics, all new materials, and I really understand the essence of what I'm doing. I am becoming a digital sculptor. Not just a digital modeler, but a digital sculptor. And when these are said and done, this will be what I'm considering as I go off. And maybe people reserve sculpture to the fabrication end of things. I don't believe that. I think art is a conceptual exercise, and I should be here at the cusp, at the front end of this coming into being. And if somebody could really get behind some of these forms and objects of what are then iterations and decisions worth making, then that's fine. So let's go back down. You can see the last one, the path index, is pretty interesting, that you end up with the same thing, but a renumber mapping. I haven't quite figured that out, but you can take a look at the data, how it changes through all these sections. What I would say is go to the grafted form right here, take your points, which is the full grid, and notice as I take that and start to manipulate things like switch I for B. So in this one, I've taken this data, if you remember it, here, and then I've said, okay, I'm going to go in and I'm going to take this data, and it won't let me open two at once, but you can see it's ABI, ABI, and you'll see the shift of the data coming into it. You see that the I enters the curly brackets. So now I've just switched I for B, and what's happened with that is you don't notice anything physically in your data, but you're starting to realize the power of manipulating the data tree. You don't notice anything different in your 11 branches with your items at the end of each branch. And then in the final one, when I swap it out for A to B, let's take a look what's happening. The data remains the same. Coming out, the data tree is registering the same, you think, until you visualize the tree. And take a look at the difference between these three trees. You've got this one and swapping A, B, and I around, and you can find other iterations to switch. You've taken this initial trunk off to these branches, off to these items to understand these things. And what has happened in the Pathmapper is you've got definitely in the path, you're using the first column here. And then as you enter the next one, as I swap B for A, I push that data back to here. Now think of this as kids in a classroom. And this might be an example that teachers can understand. These are the students in the rows. These are the chairs in the rows. And these are the rows in the classroom. So what happens is that starts to have control over what I'm grabbing and manipulating. And the combinations are endless. Can you visualize this? Can you see path mappers? Can you see drawing trees? Can you see the data being influenced by that? And can you gain control through the path mapper? And what this allows you to do is deal in lists of lists. And you start to enter a whole other realm that maybe some of you have gone into scripting into Python and C and VB script. Some of you have chosen to stay to the sets, to the manipulation of nodes with calling, the list items. Some of you have gone into the maths and said I'll control it by functions and polynomials and all that. I think it would be very interesting. And the reason I'm throwing this out here is because Daniel Kristev did a tutorial on the Pathmapper. It's taken me a year to even attempt to get my head around it, but I want to see the effects of gaining control over these simple path mapper functions, which are in your trees. You go in here and you'll see, and I've been told, stop using shift paths as much. Stop flattening trees. Know exactly what's happening when you deal with this. Keep in mind, this is a flat plane of points. We can enter a whole realm of grafting that into a full cube. And then you're dealing with really having to know where your points are. And if you don't do this yet and go into your display a numbered list of what's happening, I'm not sure if this will be big enough, but if I grab those points and I start to think of them as numbers, and let's grab the size, they're all categorized. They're all in there. They're all being understood. I just blew them up into massive numbers. Let's do 1.0. And let's put that in and see our numbers get a little more reasonable. And let's shrink them way down. And as we go on in, we're like, oh my gosh, are we really dealing in this numbered system? Have this on as a visualization tool as you go in and draw out other points into what you're actually numbering and changing. It's a pretty simple, it's a pretty interesting point of visualization. It's color coded into graphed lines, and you start to grab at your data and say, what exactly am I doing here as I manipulate these items? So very cool tool to start playing with, and maybe not something people want to wrap their head around. I don't blame you if you're a little intimidated by it, but this is where there can be a very exciting realm of what's happening. I'm going to copy and paste the last one. You can see that we actually have data. I have items I can start to grab hold of and lay hold of through these simple tools, and begin to understand my geometry and have all surface points controlled and not rely on the nodes and the codes and the scripts that are within it. I'm going deeper and deeper and deeper and deeper. So Pathmapper, give it a try, have a look, open it up early, and start to conceive how number is the basis of everything. And if not, screw all this, go get a book on Plato and read Plato.